Good morning and good afternoon to everyone who's tuning in to this webinar. Welcome to our Ukraine in Europe webinar series, which is part of the Global Europe program at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. This is the latest iteration of a series of webinars that feature discussions with prominent experts and leaders on Ukraine and on the grave challenges Ukraine faces going forward, and also its prospects of the prospects of its European future going forward. Let me introduce you to our speakers today. We will be discussing one of the very urgent and existential challenges for Ukraine. It's economic survival. Much is being said about the security aspects, which of course is predominant, but the economic survival of Ukraine and the prospects for its thriving in the future will also make or break this country going forward. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Natalie Jaresko. She is managing director of EY Parthenon, where she leads sovereign restructuring efforts and large-scale public sector turnarounds. Natalie is a long-term Ukraine expert and contributor to Ukraine's present and future. Ukraine served as a Minister of Finance of Ukraine in 2014-16, possibly the most difficult time in Ukraine's history when the war with Russia started, or Russia's aggression against Ukraine started. Natalie also served for 5 years from 2017 to 2022 as the executive director of the Financial Oversight and Management Board in Puerto Rico, also with a very challenging portfolio on her hands. Natalie spent a very long time in Ukraine, where she founded and led a Horizon Capital, a private equity fund, with $600 million under management. And before that, she was a president CEO of Western NIS Enterprise Fund, which I should note, where I had the pleasure of actually working with her on the development of small and medium enterprises in Ukraine through direct investments. Welcome, Natalie. We also are pleased to welcome Artem Gergun, who's a fellow at the Kennan Institute. He's also an advisor to the chairman of the Economic Affairs Committee in the Ukrainian Parliament, the Verkhovna Rada. He's a visiting fellow of the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna and a research scholar of the Skovoroda Institute of Philosophy of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. So we have this excellent lineup. And without further delay, let me turn to Natalie to give us the introduction to the set of challenges and possible ways to overcome them. Natalie, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Mariana, for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to speak to everyone today. I'm excited to hear Artem. But I'll start by saying I don't believe you can unravel security and economic prospects. So I don't think there is a conversation where you can isolate one from the other. Ukraine's economy depends short, medium, and long term on security. Short term, it relies on air defense such that more and more of our infrastructure is not destroyed. Medium term, long term, it's clear. And I think not only Ukraine today, but the world faces the greatest challenges, certainly in our lifetimes, but possibly even several generations. It's existential. And for Ukraine in particular, I think these risks are existential. And I think for all of us, it's a question of whether or not we will shape the future or whether the future will shape us. And so we need to, in a sense, run toward the problems that we see. And to do that, I think we have to identify what the challenges are, what's next. And I think the challenges have increased in the last few weeks with the US elections. And I'll start with that. I think we are facing a tremendously unpredictable political environment globally, not just in the United States, but the United States is a main driver of that unpredictability. I think we're going to be entering a period of trade wars where Ukraine might be in between because it isn't one of the biggest exporters or importers, so it's not the main player on the stage. I think we're facing a world of currency insecurity. There is way too much discussion of the decline in the US dollar and the rise of crypto. I think we're facing massive climate change and pandemics, as you see from the Canadian bird flu and the announcement from Finland that they're going to introduce vaccines already. They fear a potential pandemic. And on climate change, the COP meetings have not been going particularly well. And that relates somewhat back to the United States not participating in full. I think nuclear proliferation is a very real possibility, given the unpredictability of the politics in the world. AI and the role of AI, both for good and for bad. AI is a technology, but in the hands of evil, I am certain it can be used to create more problems versus in the hands of good. Robotics is so a changing world in terms of the job structures, skill structures that are needed. And at best, I think we're facing rapidly compounding change. At worst, I think this is the perfect storm. For Ukraine, my focus would be that we do some scenario planning. I feel as if we are constantly trying to determine what is next, and I don't think we can. And so I would suggest that we look at a handful of scenarios. And I also think that often because we're at war and because it's existential, we focus 1 year in advance. And I think we need to broaden that just a bit. So scenario A for me is we continue as is. And we have an alliance that supports us both financially, militarily, let's say through 2025 at least. The war continues. We have no ceasefire, no peace agreement because it's impossible to reach one. And the question there is, how do we use that time that we have, whether it's a year or two or more, to identify a way to end the war with peace and justice for Ukraine? In scenario B, which I think is more likely, B and C both have to do with the ceasefire being negotiated between parties, and I don't even know with whom at this point, but between parties, important parties. And I think that creates, if that's done during 2025, an enormous number of challenges for which we need to plan. I think that it challenges the alliance that we have today, the coalition that we have behind Ukraine today. If the United States, for example, uses this opportunity to say, you know what, we achieved peace, even if it's temporary. This is now Europe's problem. That puts enormous stress on the European coalition. I think over time, we will need to really focus on trying to extend sanctions and export controls beyond any ceasefire. But we also need to keep in mind extending the financial support that we're getting to the budget for as long as is possible. I think, you know, we're set for 2025 in a sense, between what we expect to come out of the EU Ukraine facility and what can come out of the ERA loan to cover for the US portion. But I don't think that that sense of security should be trusted. I think that going forward, it's going to be much, much harder to cover our financial deficits, even if we're not at war, because our military budget will not shrink. We all understand that a ceasefire is not peace. And at any moment, as I was in 2014 negotiating, war can continue, restart. So I think that we need to make sure that over the next, we have 2 months right now with this administration left, but also to prepare for that transition, we would need to focus on ensuring that, in fact, the ERA loan, the 50 billion euro, is available before the end of the year, documented, finished with all the different parties, the US on its piece, the Japanese, Canadians on its piece, and so on. Having that actually documented, signed, and delivered is, I think, critical for 2025. I think beyond that, we need to press on the US administration with regard to Repo Act and the $5 billion that's been identified by the US Treasury of sovereign assets here in the United States, because that legislative authority already exists. Doesn't require much more. I think that there is an element of the Repo Act that we haven't pressed maybe hard enough on, and that's the question of identifying correspondent banking accounts that are in the United States, because the Repo Act actually is open to that concept of counting correspondent banking accounts in the United States as sovereign assets. Beyond the $5 billion, how much is there? Treasury did not file a public response to the legislation, including those correspondent bank accounts. And then I think there's a longer term push, but a push for Europe to unlock the 350 billion of sovereign assets that are in their control. I think that's on the foreign side. Internally, I think we need to move to a much stricter war footing. I believe that from a budget standpoint. I believe that from prioritization of where we accept and how we utilize our foreign aid, whether it's in multi-development banks or multilateral development banks or IFIs. I think we need to spend more time directing them, but we can't direct them to the projects if we ourselves haven't defined those priorities. I look at scenario C as being a worst case analysis, where we are not able to count on that coalition beyond 2025 in any way. And you have to do all the things that I just mentioned in scenario B, but I think you have to go even further internally. And to some extent, I think we need to take action to identify even today, what are the swiftest economic engines that we can actually put in place now that don't require enormous foreign aid and don't require enormous foreign investment, and what can those economic engines produce in terms of revenues, both GDP and tax revenues, to continue enabling a government to function when and if the Western financing for our social budget ends. I think we have to rely to a great extent on domestic capital, which means to rely on domestic capital, we need to change our system of investigations and control and police and VEB and the numerous organizations that are right now a disincentive for domestic capital to function in Ukraine. And then our labor force. And our labor force, I think we have to start at the very bottom, which is mental health. Skill sets are great, but mental health is a critical thing to focus on now. And veterans health, and how they are a part of this war footing that we're on. How do we enable them to provide their skills, and how do we link them to that economic future? And then transparency in all government actions. And I think that transparency has to be maximized in order to give both society trust back in government, but also to provide civil society with the tools to call a spade when it happens. The last thing I'll say is we need to include in this scenario B and C how we engage the world through our successes. So recently there was an announcement of the Trezu platform, and the Trezu platform would allow other countries, governments, businesses to learn from our success in cyber defense. And I think more and more of how we bring those skills to the world will keep the world engaged with Ukraine, even if an alliance falls apart, even if it becomes more complicated to raise foreign capital. We need to make sure everyone understands the value of Ukraine throughout this process. And I'll leave it at that. I'm sure Artem will have more answers for you. I am a little bit concerned about the future, as you can tell.
Natalie, thank you so much. And so all of us, I think, are concerned about the future in more than one way. Thank you for starting us off with these remarks. I would just encourage audience to and remind them that you can pose your questions in the Q&A function in online as you are watching this. But for now, and I'll parlay these questions to our speakers during the Q&A session. With that, let me turn to Artem. You have some slides to share with us and work through some scenarios as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to this very important conference. In terms of Natalie's scenarios, I think my research focuses on scenario C, which means that Ukraine will be short on foreign financial aid, and what can we do in that situation? My hope is that it won't be, this scenario won't be realized, but just in case, we need to have this plan and be prepared to realize it in order to thrive through this barbaric conflict and have a hope for better economic future. So let me start. I will start with Russia and with explaining some basic Keynesian concepts. Why John Maynard Keynes? Because in my research, I made a step back and try to force myself think out of the box and to look what type of economics was during World War II. And I found out that it was a very different type of economics, and it's tied to John Maynard Keynes and his economic theory. And I will try to explain some basic Keynesians for the auditory, such as, for example, household fallacy. That means that government is not like a household. It can spend more than it earns in its revenues. And in times of economic downturn, it can do counter-cyclical policies through, particularly through such schemes as deferred consumption and limiting convertibility of its domestic currency. Remember, these recipes were developed during the World War II for Great Britain, and they were also, these theories were put into practice in US. And Russia also did something similar right before the start of the war, so they were preparing. And this type of Keynesians, I call it bastard Keynesians, which is named after traditional Russian footwear. So this is the author of this politics, Mr. Oreshkin, who is a top advisor to Putin, and he publicly endorsed the view that deficits don't matter, but aggregate demand does. And it was as early as 2019. So they were preparing the economy for military effort. So how do they do it? They are running a budget deficit. The money going into parts of Russian industry which can operate without foreign currency. So basically, the only thing they can do in Russian rubles is just producing tons of weapons, and they do it. So you can see that military industry complex picks up, people getting a rise in their pays, and the aggregate demand rises up, so does the GDP growth. We can see that they've reached full utilization of production capacities in these industries, so they hit their physical limits. And they also hit the limits in terms of labor force. So you can see there's virtually no unemployment in Russia right now. But they forgot about the deferred consumption schemes, which I will talk later. Basically, newly minted rubles went into household consumption. And as you can see, these white bars representing it that Russian households, they put newly minted rubles into consumption, particularly into real estate market. And you can see on the right that the price of the square meter of the real estate in Russia right now is just skyrocketing. This led to inflation, of course, and Russian central bank had to react. So they now have one of the highest interest rates in the world. And apparently, Mr. Oreshkin haven't read this little book in the right, How to Pay for the War by John Maynard Keynes. He warned in that book exactly against this type of development. And he proposed that in order to combat inflation, you need deferred consumption schemes, but not in interest rates policy, which will just kill your aggregate demand. So now we see the consequences. Russia had to kill their preferential mortgage program, which means that the soldiers who are fighting on the front line, they were stripped of the main incentives to fight against Ukraine. So you got the raise in your salary, and your family would have a preferential mortgage. But now this is not the case. So this is the breach of the social contract. We can see also twofold rise in microloans and personal bankruptcies in 2 years because of that higher interest rate policies. That means that we can see more and more Raskolnikovs in the next years in Russia. This is how Russia import their stuff. This is how they export. This is, by the way, my favorite slide. So this is a Liberian tanker called Ligovsky Prospect, smuggling Russian oil. This is their trade balance, which we can see that they don't get much foreign currency for the export. For the most part, it's nominated in rubles and other non-convertible currencies of the world. And Keynes was advocating against that scheme. The logics of the war is the same. And in Britain, they had this problem when the British firms, disguised as non-residents, they bought British export for British pound. And Keynes immediately killed this scheme. So from the Keynesian perspective, gas for ruble is a very harmful scheme. And we can see why, because too much rubles is circulating in the Russian economy. And that creates some significant problems. Now, is China going to help with that? No, because they are providing liquidity in swaps. And that means that the terms of offering that liquidity they are very tight. And recently in September, after invoking a sanction on MOEX, the difference between the price for yuan in Shanghai and Moscow was up to 42%. And this is a situation when nobody in Russian elite circles is happy about. Of course, they are ramping up their expenditures on defense, but if we put things into perspective, that means they are spending like 6, maybe 7, maybe 8% of their GDP into military production. But if you look into the World War II world, and if we look to US during the World War II, we can see that actually during the World War II, US was spending up to 44% of GDP for producing weapons and military equipment. And Russia is producing military equipment at the rate of 6, 7, maybe 8%. So this is not even close to US during the World War II. But at the same time, they are significantly overheating their economy. They've reached their limits. And if they will carry on in such a manner for a year, for 2 years, for 3 years, I don't think this is a sustainable situation for Russia, because they would kill their aggregate demand at all. And they need some kind of economic recession in order to resolve their problems. So unlike Russians, unlike Mr. Oreshkin, I will now turn to Singapore. I spent last 5 years I spent in Singapore researching their financial system. And this man, his name is Gokun Svi. He's a doctor, actually, Gokun Svi. He is the first financial minister of Singapore. He also served as Minister for Defense for 10 years, by the way. And he was a good disciple of Keynes because he made his PhD at London School of Economics in early 50s. By the way, this is his intellectual legacy, and it's quite abundant. There's even a collection of anecdotes by this man. So he came up with that scheme Basically, it means that they split the banking sector in two parts. Residents and resident banks and financial organization, they can deal in any kind of currencies, including their domestic currency, but non-residents, their access to domestic currency is very limited. And Singaporean dollars circulates in this gray area. So it's just recirculates every time. That means that through like circulating your domestic currency, you can finance any type of expenditure which you can do using just your domestic currency. So they have used the Central Provident Fund, which is actually a centralized government-controlled pension fund, to organize so-called liquidity drain, which means if you are printing money, if you're fiscally stimulating your economy, you need some kind of method to suck out the excessive liquidity from your financial system. And they do it through the pension system. So how they do it? The pension fund buys government securities from the government, and then the government builds social housing for that money, and then the citizens of Singapore, because of fiscal stimulus, get the rise in their pays and their salaries, the same as Russian, for example, do now. They contribute to that pension fund, and then when you're hitting a certain age limit, you can exchange your pension balances for a social housing. So you can get, let's say, a very nice 4 or 5 room flat in the center of Singapore using your pension balances at the Central Provident Fund. This is the way Singaporean system operates. So you can see they use this policy in times of economic downturns. So basically, when the GDP goes down, they are building social housing because population is on the rise and the demand is high, and anytime you need this housing at mass. This is an example of some clever accounting. This is the structure of the government securities portfolio, and you can see that the blue bars are these, they're called special Singaporean government securities, which are sold by the government exclusively to the centralized pension fund. This is how they actually fiscally stimulate the economy through their pension system. Sometimes Singapore is referred as a tax haven, and this is not true if you are a citizen of Singapore, because the deduction to the pension fund can be up to 50% of the payroll. Now this comes this deferred consumption part. If you look how they do it, so they do it without commercial banks in the scheme. So any policy of the central bank regarding the interest rate, it's not affecting the question of housing. So unlike mortgage, deferred consumption scheme means that you pay, and then you consume. But in the mortgage scheme, which is affected heavily by the movement into interest rates, you like consume first, but then you pay, and these payments, they are very sensitive to interest rate moves. But in Singaporean kind of system, it's possible to escape these fluctuations. As you can see, the ownership of the social housing is very high, and people of Singapore like this scheme very much. It means that if you own a property in Singapore, you kind of own a stake in your own, a stake of your own country. You own a stake in the future of your own country. And now comes the Ukrainian part. So if we, let's say, imagine that we could implement a scheme for Ukraine, that means that soldiers who are fighting on the front line, they can get the housing for their families virtually for free, because you never see your pension money. So it's kind of deducted from your salary automatically, and they are piling up and reaching some threshold. You can exchange this money to directly to having a new nice house, and it can provide incentive for people at the front line to fight, because they would be sure that their family is protected. And in terms of fiscal deficits, you shouldn't be afraid of fiscal deficits in times of war. And Singapore, though it was not in times of war, but they were running significant fiscal deficits up to 40% of their GDP because of that scheme. And in Ukraine, we have only 26, 27% of fiscal deficit. So we have the room up to 40% of the GDP to catch up. The same as in Singapore, we have the massive inflow on foreign currency exchange through financial aid support. We also have the situation which Singaporeans had in 70s, 80s, and even early 90s, when the imports were structurally higher than the exports. We also have kind of the same institutional framework, because we also have a centralized pension fund. We also have state-owned real estate construction firms. So we lack only the element of deferred consumption. And this is not a big deal, really. It's you need just to pass some legislation in the Verkhovna Rada and put it into work. In terms of real sector resources, we also have our production capacities underutilized, paradoxically, in times of war. And we have quite high unemployment, so we can use these resources for building, for constructing the social housing. We also have money in our banks. This private capital that Natalie was talking about. So really, we have this capital, and if the government will lead the way, I think private capital will also participate in that story. So I've asked my friend, who was running real estate development projects worth $200 million and more. Can Ukraine build housing using just its domestic currency? And he said yes. Basically, it's possible. And he devised it's a massive file in Excel format. I won't show you the whole file, but basically it means that if we will build social housing using such deferred consumption scheme and pension money, we can do it using our own domestic currency. And that means that we can focus all the international foreign aid on, for example, on building factories and plants, especially military, producing military plants and factories. And it will, construction and military production will give good multipliers into economy, and the economy will grow up in a Keynesian fashion. So we support our aggregate demand. We employed all of our domestic resources, and this will be a very good, sound foundation for post-war reconstruction. Yes. Sometimes I'm criticized, especially by my Ukrainian colleagues, that Singapore is an authoritarian government and we should not copy the economic recipes. My answer to this, that this is actually not true, because if you look to the Economist Democracy Index, Ukraine is ranking much below than Singapore. So we have like a room to catch up with Singapore in terms of democracy. And this slide is about the Ukrainian economy. Actually, it's not a military economy. It's not operating on military footing. Because I won't show you much of statistics, but just a few headlines. Number of cafes are up 35% paradoxically during the war times, but our Ukroboronprom, which is the main government contractor for producing weapons, is it has more supply opportunities than demand from the government. And paradoxically, even our own military experts, such as Mykola Beleskov from Fond Povernis Живым, and I know everybody in Ukraine knows that fund, he 2 years ago, he did an article about that we don't need a military economy in our country. This has surprised me. I don't think this type of public mood is very good right now. This is the outcomes of my project. So 2 years ago, I came up with that project to the people from Verkhovna Rada and National Bank. I did a scientific article about that, also a like more popular article in Ukrainian, and I will translate it in English, I think here at Wilson Center. And this is the last slide. This is a citation from Dr. Gokin's work, where he says that neoclassical theory, which is a dominant paradigm of economics, theoretical paradigm of economics right now, is it doesn't understand the real causes of Southeast Asians' economies' prosperity. But if you take a step back to Keynesianism, you can perfectly understand why is it so. So that's it. I'll leave it there. So if you have question, I would be glad to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. If you could just take these slides down, it'd be great. We do have some interest already. We have some questions in the chat. Let me just take the prerogative of the chair to follow up with both of you. One is to ask Natalie sort of your initial thoughts and reactions to possibly using the Singaporean model, lessons from it for the Ukrainian case. And also to ask you, Artem, you pointed out the similarities, right? Which is always, only one side of the equation. There probably are significant differences. So what differences matter most for this sort of deferred consumption through housing, given that Ukraine has a very dwindling population, people are leaving, there's probably an excess of housing right now, given the outflows of people. And also, if either one could address I'm not the economist, but what it seems to me, there's a mismatch between this high unemployment rate, low production, meaning the excess capacity, right? The existence of the excess capacity, and there's capital in the banks, which you seem to suggest, Artem. Why not put all these three elements together to fuel, military production instead of waiting for it to be handed over from abroad? I'll turn to you, Natalie, first for a set of comments.
That's a lot of different questions, Mariana. Let me start by saying I think the dissimilarity with what is going on in Singapore is the following. At least to date, the way the Ukrainian economy has been functioning during wartime since the full-scale invasion is to divide its budget into two. There is the military budget, which includes everything from the financing that goes to Ukroboronprom to the financing that goes to soldiers for salaries to anything involved with the military. 100% of Ukrainian taxes, customs duties, 100% of that goes to the military budget. And what that means is, no matter how much more income there is, that income is pulled for the military budget. And the reason for that is because up until very recently, most donors were not willing to put any money into the Ukrainian military budget. That has changed with some countries, Denmark, for example. However, even that is questionable whether it's going into the military budget or whether it's going into private manufacturers of weaponry. So what we have is a $25 to $36 billion social budget gap that needs to be funded. And that's for pensions, wages, teachers, doctors. It's not going into infrastructure per se. We don't have a capital expenditure budget of any real significance at this date. That's the first thing that shrank when we needed to shrink the budget. And so as the 25 to 36 disappears, and that 36 includes domestic bond issuance, meaning the government is issuing bonds, which are being purchased by the banks, which the banks believe is a sufficient level of income, a better level of income than they would get by lending in the risk environment that they're in. So they look at it as the least risky investment, although, you know, we all know that at some point, domestic debt restructuring will have to happen. But they don't look at it that way. And so right now you've got banks who don't feel the need to invest because it's a higher risk with a lower potential return. And the government, the more that it issues these bonds, gives them that ability to not do that. But as the amount of money coming in from the West starts to be reduced, if we are not successful enough in getting access to Russian sovereign assets past the year 2025 for operating purposes, again, I'm not even talking about rebuilding at this point, for operating, then I think the questions of investing in housing are really, unfortunately, secondary. And I think at most we need to, when I think of a wartime economy, and I think we should have been on one for a while, we need to reduce that social budget, first of all. So we really need to look hard at what we're financing and whether or not all of it needs to be financed. My experience is that sometimes we don't even know where our savings are. And I'll use Puerto Rico as an example. When we went through the labor budget at the Department of Education, 20% of the salaries were being paid to people who had died, were on pension, or who had left the country. So there are savings to be found everywhere. It's a matter of looking and of prioritizing the social expenditures. And then when you go to the infrastructure, and I don't disagree that housing is needed because people have moved. We've got a shift of population to the West, and that housing in the East has been, as we know, utterly destroyed to dust. So there is a definite need for housing, and social housing is something that the government's been working on for, in particular, the internally displaced, the 3-4 million people who have shifted. You also need, because of that shift, more bunkers, larger bunkers for children in schools, because the schools weren't built for the populations that we currently have. You need to put infrastructure money into the continuously destroyed electricity, heating, water, and healthcare system as an emergency. And that's not rebuilding, that's just maintaining the ability to provide our population with basic services. And I guess I think that international financial institutions will not fund our military. Maybe dual technology from the EIB, maybe. But I think more of that is going to go into that critical infrastructure. And that's kind of where we need to prioritize it while we use our domestic resources for the military. I think if you want to see more investment in ukur oboron from, then you have to be much more creative, because most foreign institutions don't want to invest in a state-owned firm. That means you have to do separate joint ventures, separate programs, or something else. I think this is going to require more creativity, but urgency. And I think that simply, I mean, I don't disagree with Artem's construct, but I don't think it is urgent enough or simple enough to finance what I think is going to be missing in potentially 12 months' time. One of the most positive things about our economy has been that we have a functional government throughout this time. If you think about other conflicts, the World Bank has a term, fragile conflict states, like Sudan, for example. They don't have a government on top of being in conflict. We are not a fragile conflict state. We are a conflict state. We are not fragile. Our democratic institutions have been functioning. We've been paying wages. Compared to 2014, when I came in as minister, we had a backlog of 6 months or more of wages to teachers, to coal miners. I mean, think about, we don't have that deep of a problem right now because of the support we've been getting. But when that support disappears or begins to disappear, if we don't have alternatives, meaning the use of the Russian sovereign assets or other, I think that we have much more banal questions to answer about how to maintain those government institutions. Because once those government institutions, once your garbage is not being picked up and there are no doctors and there are no teachers to teach your kids, then you're going to see a much greater migration out, which we want to avoid. We want to actually convince people to come back, that the government institutions do work. So I think from my perspective, we've got a limited number of levers to use to try and ensure that as global attention to our financial problems recedes, with hopes that they continue military support, we have other alternatives to finance the most critical of our social services. I hope that answered some of your questions.
Thank you so much. That was a very comprehensive set of reactions. Artem, you can pick and choose which questions you want to react to, but there's also a question I'm going to pose to you from the audience. Glenn Wright in Kiev asks, given the current situation, would you rather be a Minister of Finance of Russia or Minister of Finance of Ukraine? I'll pose that to you since you did this comparison.
First of all, let me answer the question of foreign aid, which is not kind of dedicated to our military industry complex. The thing is that if we are talking, for example, with European Union, guys, if you don't want to give us money for developing our own Ukrainian military complex, it means that we, as Ukraine, as country, we need to sell more grain, we need to sell more sugar, we need to sell more chicken meat, and this will engulf your European market of these goods. So why not to do it in Ukraine, investing in Ukrainian military industry complex, and we will get all these needed 155s and the guns which propel them, and we will stop dumping our prices in your internal market. This sounds as a very good bargain with the European Union.
Artem,
yeah.
The reality is that they don't allow us to flood their markets. So that is unreal for the EU, because we have limits. Every time something begins to affect their markets, they adopt a limit to our exports in that category. So I don't think that threat is meaningful for the Europeans.
Well, the story with Poland and all our neighbors, it was very vivid that despite all this limitation from the Brussels, all these procedures, the real interest in that business is quite huge. And this is not only the problem from Ukrainian side, it's the problem from Poland's, Hungary's, Slovakian, and all other countries which participated in that story.
I think much of the debate that you heard and the violence that occurred at the borders was politically driven prior to Polish elections by a particular party, unfortunately aligned with Russia, because when the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine did all of the monitoring at the border, there was no grain being sold in Poland. The grain was going all the way out through Poland without being sold. It did not affect their markets. It wasn't even being sold in Europe. So I don't think that you can count on that kind of a threat with the Europeans. And I think that we need to think about, unfortunately, that with the threat of the United States not being or the unpredictability of the United States not being a sufficient partner in security areas, if the idea that the United States may or may not live by its commitments in NATO, then the Europeans are going to look to invest in their own defense industry as a priority. And it would be natural for any government to think that way. So I think we're also now battling whose defense industry is a priority, ours or theirs. And I think that's another challenge that we have.
Yeah, so Artem, maybe I'll go back to you, but also, there's a question from the audience as well, from Christine Casati, who's a global business development at Princeton. And she is bringing up the question of Ukraine's accession to EU. That process is underway, right? So Ukraine has to sort of also fulfill certain commitments and be able to accord to some of the EU requirements and so forth. So certainly, playing hardball with kind of dumping threats with the EU might not be the best strategy in that regard. But if you want to pick up the threads that we've left before, just very briefly, there's some other questions in the chat, also concerning the role of the European Union and possibly filling in the gaps left out by the retreating United States. But I'll turn it back to you to finish your thoughts.
If you look to the experience of major free market economies at the time of World War II, they faced exactly the same problem Ukraine is facing now. This is about 60% budget deficit. So the UK had at the time 60% budget deficit. US also had even higher budget deficits. So the logics of producing military production is exactly the same. And if you are not producing enough, you face actually the consequence in military terms. And at Wilson Center, we had a very interesting discussion about how European Union military complex actually operates. And this have a perfect free market logics when you produce fewer quantities of the military production, but at a higher price. But this logic, it's perfect from the economics perspective. But if you look into your needs, into your security threats, this is not a method. This is not. This is just a peaceful time, institutional inertia. And if you continue with that inertia for years, you won't have that power to stand up to the bully. And my point is that we need to step back, to think out of the box, to look at the experience from previous years, from especially World War II years, and to look how these countries, UK, US, funded these budget deficits. And they were just protecting their industrial complex interests. They were funding it. And this is what the top priority. Why? Because per se, military production gives very good multipliers to your economy. And if you're at scale of World War II, you can face some rationing, because of the scale, it was massive. But in the case of Ukraine, I think the question of rationing is not so relevant because we already have the overcapacity of producing food, for example. So why don't we look into experience from the past era and do something about that, and not just only Ukraine, but European Union as well? Because if you look into recent initiatives among the leadership of European Union. They want to build their security by their own, so have their own security system, not relying on the transatlantic partners. And how do you do it? You need to fiscally stimulate your economies to do it. And there is a problem within the European Union to do that because there is no pan-European Ministry of Finance. So they need to coordinate it in different jurisdictions, in different ministers of finance in different countries. And this is a very tough job. It's much more easier to do it in Ukraine, actually, because we have a Ministry of Finance who can do it. And we have our own domestic currency. We don't have euro. And this is very good, actually, for developing a military production complex, paradoxically.
Thank you, Artem. We are getting close to the end of our time. Let me just collect the last round of questions from the audiences and ask you to react very quickly. Some of them have been addressed in our discussion, and most of them deal with the role of Europe, right? So the disengagement of US from Ukraine is likely to come together from a larger disengagement from Europe as well. So that's kind of compounding the ask from the European Union. So one of the questions from Mark Gallagher, an economist, to Natalie says, it seems US will stop supporting Ukraine. Can EU replace both financial and military support? Can the Europeans hold it together, and for how long? $1 million question. And another one from Jim Milano, the diplomatic fellow at the Wilson Center, also asking, the EU has been reluctant to seize Russian sovereign assets, concerned about international law. What instruments could be convincing to these skeptics at the EU? Let me turn to you, Natalie, first.
I'll answer the second question first. Absolutely, the EU has been against seizing the sovereign assets for legal reasons. I think the only situation that could shift that view is if things were, let's say, in the worst case scenario. So where the United States disconnects, as you said, Mariana, and where they're unable to reach an agreement, for example, related to your first question, to replace all of the US contribution, whether it's military and or finance. And then they're forced to look at other alternatives that don't necessarily require an EU vote, where they can unfortunately find themselves unable to have unanimity. And there are methods of doing that with the sovereign assets, since so much of it is physically in Belgium, in one country. So it would have to be a real crisis situation from my perspective that would force the EU, because they're not going to issue bonds, it appears to me. I don't see them running a larger budget deficit for this purpose. I don't see them having the unanimity to do things financially that they need to. And so my fear is that, although I think they can help for a year or two, because they've already set up mechanisms, for example, the Ukraine facility, but once that facility is finished, I'm not sure that they'll be able to pull together the resources without taking the sovereign assets. So it's crisis-based.
Thank you. And Artem, I'll turn to you, but also we'll pile on another question from the audience that might be relevant just to you. It's from Jennifer Brush, a former OSCE head of mission in Moldova. And she's asking to address the question of the effect of EU and US sanctions on the Russian economy. So you talked about the lack of foreign currency, but have the sanction hit the Russian economy as hard as we might have wished? So over to you.
Thank you very much for that question. Unfortunately, any sanction regime is not crushing any type of economy. So we see Iran is functioning for over, I don't know how many years under sanctions, and they are threatening to produce even nuclear weapons, for example. So the purpose of sanctions is not to stop a country from military effort. The purpose of sanctions is to significantly degrade the effort. And the fact that in Ukraine we have electricity still, we have communication systems working, we have internet, thanks God. This is because of Western-led sanctions. So they degraded significantly Russian military effort. And that's why Russia is not so potent in pure military terms. That's why Russia is playing with all this hybrid warfare, because they failed to do significant progress in terms of pure military scenarios on the battleground. The purpose of the First Tank Army of Russia is to occupy Belgium, actually, their military purpose. So if they are occupying some village in Donetsk Oblast right now, it does mean that they are weak in military terms. And sanctions, they help degrade military effort of Russia. This is their purpose, and I think they are working. They're working very well, and right now they are spurring different conflicts in the Russian elite circles, which can not solve all of the problems we are facing in Europe, but they can significantly delay Russia into their development to a true military power in terms of World War II. That would be my answer.
Thank you so much for that. We're unfortunately out of time, even though we're not out of interest in these really important set of questions. Let me thank our esteemed speakers, Natalie, to you, and to you, Artem, for joining us today to start us off and thinking about these really difficult times that lay ahead. Hopefully we can all join arms and join efforts to try and come up with solutions the best we can. With that, I close this webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And you can see the recording of this webinar on our website in just a couple of days. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.